It was a cold evening, the kind that makes your bones ache after a long shift. Officer James Miller trudged down Maple Street, his feet dragging with exhaustion. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. After 12 hours of grueling work, all he could think about was getting home to his bed, slipping into a moment of quiet peace. But then he heard it, a soft padding sound behind him. He turned, blinking through the dim light, to find a scruffy little dog trailing him. The puppy's fur was matted, its body gaunt, but its eyes, those eyes were filled with something more than just hunger or fear. It was as if the dog was silently pleading for help. James shook his head and waved his hand dismissively. "Go on, get home," he called, but the dog didn't budge. Instead, it tilted its head, its brown eyes never leaving his, as it continued its determined march, keeping just enough distance to seem respectful. Every few steps, James glanced back, and there it was again, the puppy, unwavering and persistent. A heavy sigh escaped James's lips. "Listen, buddy, I can't help you. I don't even have the time for a pet," he muttered, trying to push it away. But the puppy didn't listen. It sat on the sidewalk, its tail swishing gently as if saying, "I'm not going anywhere without you." With a reluctant sigh, James knelt, his heart tugging at the desperate look in the dog's eyes. As he reached out, he noticed something tucked in the worn leather collar, a crumpled piece of paper. It was then, as his fingers unfolded the paper, that his entire world shifted. "Help. My brother is sick. No food, no water. Apartment 3B. James's pulse quickened. The urgency of the message hit him like a physical blow. Without another word, he sprang to his feet, and the puppy bounded alongside him, leading the way. A race against time. James's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the puppy down the street. The little dog's steps were quick, almost frantic, as it led him toward the apartment complex. Each moment felt heavier than the last, as the words on the paper echoed in his mind. No food, no water, brother sick. He couldn't ignore the urgency. The apartment building soon came into view, a crumbling structure that seemed to sag under its own weight. The paint on the walls peeled in long, jagged strips, and the windows were either broken or patched with cardboard. The place had seen better days. Long ago, it seemed. The puppy's nails clicked against the cracked pavement as they neared the entrance. It trotted ahead, weaving between James's legs, guiding him with a newfound energy. James reached the door, which hung loosely on its hinges, barely able to keep the wind from blowing it wide open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dampness and neglect. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow across the dingy hallway. The wallpaper, once floral and welcoming, was now peeling away in defeated strips. The place looked abandoned, but the puppy, full of determination, led James to the stairwell. "Third floor," James muttered to himself, his police instincts kicking into high gear. Each step he took felt heavier, the weight of the situation settling deeper into his gut. Something was terribly wrong here. They reached the third floor, and the puppy paused in front of a door marked 3B, its tail wagging with anxious anticipation. James knocked, the sound of his fist hitting the wood echoing through the hollow silence. There was no response. He knocked again, louder this time, his fist thudding against the frame. "Police," he called out, his voice firm, but there was no answer. The silence inside felt wrong, too complete. The kind of silence that made his instincts scream that something was terribly amiss. Beside him, the puppy began to whine, scratching anxiously at the door. James tried the handle. Locked. His pulse quickened, his hand hovering over his radio. But there was no time for protocol. Something in his gut told him that if he didn't act now, it might be too late. He stepped back, took a deep breath, and kicked hard next to the lock. The door splintered with a sharp crack. Inside the darkness, the smell hit him first, a mixture of decay, spoiled food, and the musty scent of unwashed bodies. He gagged, trying to steady his breath, But there was no time to focus on the stench. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and in the corner of what could only be the living room, he saw them. A small boy, no older than 8, sat pressed against the wall, his thin arms wrapped tightly around a bundle, his baby brother. The older boy's eyes were wide, panicked, yet they seemed to be searching James's face, as if hoping he was someone who could make all of this disappear. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and his clothes hung off him like they were meant for someone twice his size. The baby in his arms was pale, its small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The older boy pulled the baby closer, pressing himself further into the corner, as if trying to disappear into the wall itself. His whole body was trembling, but he never took his eyes off James, a mixture of fear and desperate hope reflected in his gaunt face. "Hey there," James said softly, lowering himself a few feet away, careful not to startle them. "I'm Officer James Miller. I'm here to help." The boy didn't speak, but his grip on his brother tightened, his knuckles turning white. When James reached out, the boy flinched so violently that his head hit the wall. The puppy, sensing the tension, darted past James and went straight to the boy, its tail wagging as it began licking his face. The puppy's unexpected gesture of affection seemed to break through the boy's fear. His rigid posture slowly relaxed, and the trembling in his limbs began to subside. Tears welled up in his eyes, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. James's heart clenched, and he quickly pulled out his phone, dialing 911. Keeping his voice calm, he requested paramedics. As he waited, he surveyed the apartment, his heart growing heavier with each discovery. The kitchen was barren, empty cabinets swinging open like hungry mouths. In the fridge, there was only a carton of spoiled milk, its contents long since turned to curdled muck. The apartment was a wasteland. There was a crib nearby, but it had soiled sheets, and a few dirty bottles were scattered around it. James's stomach twisted. This wasn't just neglect, it was abandonment. The letter from the parents echoed in his mind. "We can't do this anymore. We'll find help and come back. Just take care of your brother. Be strong." James's jaw clenched as he gripped the letter, its crinkling sound resonating in the silence. These weren't the actions of parents desperately seeking help. This was the cruel and cold abandonment of children left to fend for themselves. The sound of sirens grew louder, and for the first time, James realized that these children had no one, no family, no support, and no one to protect them. But that was about to change. The weight of responsibility. As the sound of sirens filled the air, James stayed close to the children. The older boy, still clutching his baby brother, watched him cautiously, not yet sure if he could trust the officer. The puppy, sensing the tension, nudged the boy's side, offering a comforting nudge. Its small, brown eyes locked with the boy's, as if reassuring him that he wasn't alone. Moments later, paramedics burst through the door, their equipment rattling as they rushed to assess the situation. The younger brother, pale and motionless, was carefully placed on a stretcher, his fragile body clearly fighting against the severe dehydration and malnutrition he had suffered. One of the medics spoke in a low voice to his partner. "Severe dehydration. Possible organ failure. We need to move fast." The older boy scrambled to his feet, his tiny hand shooting out to grab James's sleeve. "No, don't take him," the boy cried, his voice breaking. "He needs me." James's heart twisted at the sight of the boy's desperation. He crouched down to the child's level, gently placing a hand over his. "It's okay, kid," James said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your brother is in good hands. The doctors are here to help him. We need to let them do their job, okay?" The boy wouldn't let go of James's sleeve, clinging to him with all his strength. It was clear this child had never known the comfort of reassurance, never had someone to trust that things would be okay. James could feel the boy's small body trembling, and he didn't hesitate. Without a word, he scooped the child into his arms, carrying him out of the apartment with the puppy trotting faithfully beside them. Outside, The cold air was a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the apartment, and James didn't stop moving until he reached the waiting ambulance. He could feel the weight of the boy's fragile body pressed against his chest, but the silent trust he felt from the child made the burden worth it. Healing and new beginnings. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked efficiently, attaching 4 lines and monitoring the baby's vital signs. The quiet beeping of the machines filled the space, creating an eerie calm, but it was better than the chaos James had witnessed in that rundown apartment. He sat beside the older boy, his arm wrapped protectively around the child, offering the comfort he had been craving for so long. The boy, who had barely spoken, now clutched James's hand. His grip tightened with each passing minute as they sped toward the hospital. The puppy, now nestled in James's lap, watched the boy with its soft, trusting gaze. The silence in the ambulance was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of the medical equipment and the muffled conversation of the paramedics. Finally, the older boy, with tears brimming in his eyes, whispered, "Is my brother going to die?" James squeezed his hand gently. "Not on my watch, kid," he replied firmly, his voice unwavering. "The doctors are really good at their jobs. They'll take care of your brother." The boy nodded, but his face was still filled with worry. His eyes flickered to his brother's tiny form on the stretcher, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Despite James's reassurance, he couldn't shake the fear that clung to him like a second skin. When they arrived at the hospital, everything moved quickly. The paramedics rushed the baby through the emergency room doors, rattling off medical terms as they worked to stabilize him. The older boy tried to follow, but the hospital staff stopped him at the entrance, their hands firm but gentle. "I need to stay with him," the boy pleaded, his voice trembling. James knelt down to the boy's level. "We'll wait right here," he said softly. "I promise we won't leave." The boy didn't respond but clung to James's side, his small fingers grasping the officer's sleeve. They sat together. The only sound in the waiting room was the occasional beep of machines from the hallway and the distant chatter of hospital staff. After a few moments, a social worker approached them, her professional demeanor softening when she saw the boy's fear. "We need to ask you some questions," she said gently. But before she could continue, the puppy stood up, its tail wagging, positioning itself between the boy and the social workers, as if sensing the boy's unease. James, observing the situation, knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy for these children. They had been through too much and they needed stability more than anything else. The truth was, he was already becoming attached to them. No matter what came next, they wouldn't face it alone. A new home. As the days stretched on, the sterile environment of the hospital felt like a cold contrast to the warmth James desperately wanted to give the children. The baby, Lucas, was stable now, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on James's shoulders. He couldn't ignore the overwhelming responsibility he felt for Noah, the older boy, who sat silently by his side, eyes fixated on his brother. It was late afternoon when James finally took a moment to step outside. He needed to clear his head, to think about what came next. When he returned, Noah was still sitting by Lucas's bedside, his hand gently resting on the crib, his face drawn with concern. The puppy, Hero, sat loyally at the foot of the bed, occasionally lifting its head to watch the boy, offering quiet comfort. James took a deep breath as he approached. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, crouching beside Noah. The boy looked up at him, still distant, his gaze avoiding James's eyes. "I'm going to take you both home with me. It's not much, but it's yours." Noah's eyes flickered briefly to James before quickly dropping back to the floor. There was fear in his eyes, the kind that James had seen before, the kind that came from years of being let down, of being told things would get better, only to be abandoned again. But James wasn't going to walk away this time. He leaned in, speaking with quiet certainty. "You're not alone anymore. I'm not going anywhere." After a long silence, Noah nodded, though his shoulders remained tense. James could feel the boy's hesitation, but there was also something else, an inkling of trust. Later that evening, James carefully packed up what little belongings the children had. A couple of worn-out blankets, some old clothes, nothing that could truly define a home. But as he loaded them into his car, a small part of him believed this might be the start of something better for them. When they arrived at his house, it was modest, nothing too fancy, but a safe place. Noah and Lucas followed him inside, their eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings. The quiet hum of the house felt strange to the children, who had known nothing but emptiness for so long. James showed them around, pointing out the kitchen stocked with food, the comfortable living room, and the spare bedroom that had been set up for them. "This is your space now," James said, trying to make it sound as welcoming as possible. "You can eat whenever you're hungry, and you're free to pick whichever bed you want." Noah hesitated at the threshold of the spare bedroom, his small hand clutching Lucas's car seat tightly. He eyed the beds, then turned his gaze back to the door. There was a quiet uncertainty in his posture that broke James's heart. "You don't have to decide right now," James said gently. "Take your time." The boy didn't speak, but after a moment, he moved slowly into the room. The puppy Hero trotted beside him, its tail wagging in encouragement. The room was small but cozy, with fresh sheets on the bunk bed and a soft nightlight plugged in. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Taking baby steps. James could see the tension in Noah's shoulders, the guarded way he moved through the house. It wasn't easy for him to trust, not after everything he had been through. But James knew they had to take it one step at a time. He didn't rush Noah. He just let him settle in at his own pace. The next morning, when James prepared breakfast, he found Noah sitting at the kitchen table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The puppy sat at his feet, its tail thumping softly against the floor, as if trying to offer comfort. James placed a stack of pancakes in front of him, along with butter, syrup, and a glass of milk. "Go ahead, buddy," James said softly. "They're better while they're warm." Noah glanced at the food but didn't reach for it. His shoulders were tense, his eyes darting between the plate and James. The hesitation was palpable. He picked up his fork slowly, his movement stiff, as though he wasn't quite sure how to eat without someone taking it from him. James didn't press. He just let Noah eat at his own pace, all while keeping the atmosphere as light as possible. They ate in silence, with only the occasional clink of silverware breaking the quiet. After breakfast, James decided it was time for a change of pace. He needed to give Noah something normal, something that could help him feel like a child again. "Hey, Noah," James said, his voice casual, "I got you something." Noah looked up, his expression wary, but his curiosity sparked. James revealed a new soccer ball, its black and white panels gleaming in the morning sunlight. Noah stared at it for a moment, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Then, as if unsure whether it was okay, he took a hesitant step forward. James gave him a playful grin, tossing the ball gently at his feet. Hero, sensing the change in the air, immediately darted after the ball, wagging his tail and barking in excitement. Noah, still hesitant, watched the dog for a moment before a small smile tugged at his lips. The game started slowly, Noah barely kicking the ball at first. But as Hero ran circles around them, the tension in Noah's body started to fade. With each kick, the smile grew. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Noah let out a laugh, a real, genuine laugh that filled the backyard. James could hardly believe it. This was the first time he had heard Noah laugh, truly laugh, without fear or sadness. The transformation had begun, a fragile trust. Weeks passed, and while Noah slowly began to open up, the scars of his past were not so easily erased. James watched him closely, noticing the little things. The way his eyes would dart nervously at sudden noises, how he would shrink back at unexpected touches. But even in the quiet moments, James could see the subtle changes. He was no longer trembling at every loud sound, no longer jumping at every shadow. And yet, There was still an underlying wariness in him. One evening, as James sat down to dinner, he noticed Noah pushing his food around on his plate. His appetite had improved, but the boy was still cautious, as if he feared the food would disappear or someone would take it from him. His fingers absent-mindedly stroked Hero's fur. The puppy curled up beside him. There was a tense stillness in the air, a reminder that Noah hadn't fully accepted that he was safe yet. "Hey, kid," James said softly, breaking the silence. "You okay?" Noah didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed the green beans to the side, glancing up at James with uncertainty. The question hung in the air, and Noah's eyes flickered down to his hands. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice quieter than usual. James smiled gently, not pressing for more. He knew this was all new for Noah, and forcing him to open up would only make him retreat further into himself. Instead, he reached for his phone and pulled up a video, something light-hearted, a show that Noah had liked when he first arrived. As the room filled with laughter from the TV, Noah's shoulders began to relax. He finally picked up his fork, taking a few tentative bites. Hero, sensing the change in mood, nudged the boy's leg, offering an extra dose of comfort. It wasn't much, but it was progress, a small step toward feeling at home. That night, as James tucked Noah into bed, he pulled up the blanket and smiled softly. "Good night, buddy," he said, his hand resting briefly on Noah's shoulder. It was the first time in weeks that Noah didn't flinch at the contact. He simply nodded, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. But even in the stillness of the night, James knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The boy still had so much to process, so much to heal from. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope that he could begin to let go of the past. The bond of family. The next day, something unexpected happened. James had taken Noah to the park to play soccer. It was supposed to be a simple outing, a chance for Noah to experience something like a normal childhood. At first, Noah had been hesitant to kick the ball, his movements stiff and uncertain. But after a few minutes, the tension had started to ease. He kicked the ball more confidently, with Hero chasing after it, barking happily. Then, out of nowhere, Noah stopped. He froze in place, his eyes wide with panic. James, who had been laughing along with the boy's progress, quickly realized that something was wrong. Noah's hands shook as he gripped the ball tightly. His breath hitched, and he looked around nervously, his eyes scanning the area. James stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What is it, buddy?" James asked gently. Noah didn't respond immediately. He just stared ahead, his eyes still darting around the park, searching for something or someone. James felt a knot in his stomach. He could see the panic building in Noah, the fear that he couldn't control. Then, quietly, Noah whispered, "I thought they might come back." James's heart dropped. It was clear now. Noah was still waiting for his parents. After everything they had been through, after all the promises they had broken, the boy still couldn't believe they wouldn't return. James crouched down, his voice steady but filled with understanding. "Noah," he said softly, "they're not coming back. But you don't need to worry about that anymore. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Noah's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, James saw the full weight of the boy's pain. But instead of pushing him away, Noah clung to him, his small hands gripping James's shirt. James held him tight, feeling the boy's fear and uncertainty, but also the faintest flicker of trust. "I'm not going anywhere," James repeated, his voice firm but kind. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The park, the world around them, faded into the background as James knelt there, holding Noah in his arms. It was then that James realized, with complete clarity, that this was his family now. No matter what had happened in the past, no matter the pain they had both endured, Noah and Lucas were his responsibility now. He would protect them, love them, and never let them go. Noah pulled away just enough to look up at James. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for someone else to take care of him. The boy's eyes, once filled with fear, now held something new: hope. James smiled softly, brushing a tear from Noah's cheek. "Let's go home, kid," he said. As they walked back to the car, Noah holding his soccer ball and Hero trotting faithfully beside them, James knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because family wasn't about who leaves, it was about who stays. And James was staying, always, a step toward healing. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Noah, once hesitant and reserved, was slowly but surely adjusting to his new life. He began to relax in James's home, moving with less caution, his once fearful eyes softening as he came to realize that his world was not going to collapse at any moment. Yet, even as he grew more comfortable, James could still see the shadows of his past lingering in his every move. The boy hadn't fully let go of the pain, and James knew that healing wasn't a quick process. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Noah picked at his food as he often did. James noticed his distracted gaze, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of his fork. Hero, as always, sat nearby, his eyes fixed on Noah, waiting for any sign of affection. James decided it was time to break the silence. "Hey, Noah," he said softly, "do you want to tell me about school tomorrow?" Noah's face tightened, and he immediately looked away, the familiar wariness returning to his features. James waited patiently, understanding that this would take time. When Noah finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can do it." James's heart clenched. He could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the fear of being abandoned once again, the fear of failing to fit in, to belong. "You don't have to do it all at once," James replied gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll take it one step at a time, okay? I'll be there with you every step of the way." Noah's eyes met his then, filled with uncertainty. But there was something else there too, a small flicker of trust. "Okay," he whispered, his voice small but stronger than before. The next morning, as they drove to school, James could feel Noah's tension in the air. The boy's fingers were tightly clenched around his backpack straps, his body stiff and rigid. James glanced over at him, offering a smile of encouragement. "You're not alone in this," James said, his voice warm. "I'll be right here when you get out." Noah didn't say anything, but he nodded, a small gesture that made James's heart swell. He had no idea what the day would bring, but he knew it was a step forward, a step toward healing, toward finding his place in the world, finding a place to belong. School was a challenge for Noah, just as James had expected. The kids in his class eyed him with curiosity, whispering behind his back, unsure of how to approach the boy who had lived through things most children could never comprehend. But James was there, in the parking lot, watching as Noah hesitated at the entrance, his eyes scanning the busy scene around him. Noah's shoulders were hunched, and his face was tense with anxiety. James stepped out of the car and approached him. "You got this, kid," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "You're stronger than you think." Noah looked up at him, his face torn between the desire to stay with James and the overwhelming fear of facing a room full of strangers. He clenched his fists at his sides, but after a long moment, he took a deep breath and walked toward the doors. That afternoon, when the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, James was waiting by the car. As Noah approached, his face was unreadable, but there was a new light in his eyes. Less fear, more curiosity. "How was it?" James asked gently. "It was okay," Noah said, his voice still hesitant but stronger than before. "I didn't talk much, but I think maybe I'll try tomorrow." James's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't much, but it was everything. For the first time in a long while, Noah was beginning to believe that he could belong, that he wasn't a burden to be carried, but a person worthy of love and care. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, Noah curled up on the couch with Hero by his side. James couldn't help but smile. The silence between them was comfortable now, not filled with uncertainty or fear, but with the quiet understanding that they were a family. James reached over and placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "You did great today," he said quietly. Noah turned to him, his eyes softening for a moment. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time he had called James that, and it hit James like a wave, raw, emotional, and full of promise. Noah was learning to trust again, and with each passing day, he was becoming more than just a child in need of protection. He was becoming James's son, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together. As Hero nestled closer to Noah, James sat back, content, knowing that the journey ahead might be hard, but it was one he was more than willing to take. They had come this far, and the road ahead was full of hope. A family united. The months that followed felt like a series of small steps, each one leading Noah and Lucas closer to the stability they had never known. James watched as Noah began to flourish in his own quiet way, laughing more freely, trusting more openly, and even making friends at school. It was a slow process, but every milestone, no matter how small, was a victory. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Noah suddenly looked up at James, his face serious yet filled with something new, something James hadn't seen before. It was a quiet confidence, an assurance that he wasn't alone anymore. "I've been thinking," Noah said, his voice steady. "I want to stay here, with you, forever." James felt a lump form in his throat. His heart swelled with pride, and he placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "You're home, buddy. You're always going to be home here." It was then that Noah smiled, a real, unguarded smile. It was the smile of a boy who had found safety, love, and belonging. For the first time in a long time, Noah wasn't waiting for someone to come back. He wasn't waiting for the next disappointment. He had a family now. Later that evening, James tucked Noah into bed. As he stood at the door, about to leave, Noah looked up at him. "Good night, Dad," he whispered, his voice full of trust and warmth. James smiled, his heart full. "Good night, son." The house was quiet, but there was peace in the air, a peace that came from knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. A family, bound not by blood, but by love, trust, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.